Hi, and welcome to our LinkedIn Live series on the release of the ISM Report on Business. My name is Dan Zeiger. I'm a senior writer and copy editor for Inside Supply Management. That's Institute for Supply Management's member publication. And we're excited to have you with us as we break down another interesting and a somewhat unexpected month in Services PMI data. The consensus forecast for the composite index reading was not much higher than its actual reading in August, which was 51.5%. But thanks to a big boost in business activities and new orders, and despite employment going into contraction, which we'll get to in a bit, the PMI blew by that projection, registering 54.9%, its highest figure since February 2023. So what put such a spring in the step of the services sector? Try and say that fast, really, 5 times. Let's get to walking through the data by bringing in Steve Miller. He's the chair of the ISM Services Business Survey Committee. And before I turn it over to Steve, let's note that just as we did for the manufacturing report on Tuesday, this data was collected before Hurricane Helene hit the southeast and before the longshoreman strike at ports on the east and Gulf coasts. Well, we'll discuss what those events mean for the sector, the services sector in October. But first, Steve, just what stood out to you about September?
So you did a really good summary, Dan. The business services, the business activity index, as well as the new orders index, were up both by more than 6%. So that was a significant improvement. Now the numbers themselves are not out of the ordinary, but certainly unexpected for this month. What we saw kind of across our survey group is that the real estate, rental and leasing, as well as construction, went into expansion mode. We only had 8 industries that were in expansion mode last month, and we're I believe it was 8 last month, and we're up to 10 this month, which is a big deal. It really, or sorry, 9 to So on the businesses, it's actually 9 to 12, and then on the new orders from 8 to 11. So a significant increase in terms of the percentage of industries. And then when you think about percentage GDP, real estate, rental and leasing, as well as construction were big drivers. Now, unfortunately, something I was also looking at was wholesale and retail trades. And unfortunately, they're staying in contraction mode, which you're hoping, going into kind of the holiday season, Jewish holidays this week, as well as, the traditional Christmas season. I was expecting to see probably more start to kick off. Now with Amazon doing their day next week as well, who knows what October holds when you balance it with the hurricane impacts, both personally as well as to business, and the longshoreman strike.
Yeah. Well, yeah, obviously, when you looked at the sub-indexes, that's, as I've always said, it's one of the most user-friendly elements of the report on business. If there was a higher than expected increase in the PMI this month, or if it's lower than expected, you can take a quick look at the table of the sub-indexes, and you can quickly find out why that happened. And this month, the business activity and those new orders, those top 2 sub-indexes stood out. A combined 13-point increase between the two. I know there were a couple of survey respondent comments in there citing the start of a new fiscal year as a big reason for potentially the increased activity. Was that a factor that you noticed? And were there any other elements that might have contributed to that?
Yeah. So looking at so I'd say the short answer is yes. The longer answer is we see inventories up again. But inventory sentiment down again. So while inventories are going up, expanding, we're seeing the inventory sentiment around are we too high, too low, or just about right? It's trending from too high down to just about right. So that couples really well with the new business, or business activity, new orders, as well as what we saw in export orders as well was a really positive sign. In public administration, their fiscal year ends in September. So if you don't spend, there's an old saying which I won't use, and I'll just say if you don't spend it this year, you don't have it to spend next year. Is the way it works in public money, because the money is no longer there on October 1st. So that we saw some commentary around that. And then some of the retail businesses are oriented towards a Q1 starting in October and getting ready for that and launching that. So hopefully we'll see that in the October numbers.
Yeah. One of the other sub-indexes that got a lot of interest today was the employment index. Before we came on here, Christina Cahill and I were sending some reactions back and forth, and I both kind of had a chuckle over a tweet that basically it said something to the effect of ISM Business Activity Index, the Bears are cheering it, and the Bulls are cheering it, and the ISM Employment Index, the Bears are ruining it. So yeah, it was it contracted. It moved into contraction territory, or was there. Tim Fiore mentioned in the manufacturing sector on Tuesday that there was been some right sizing going on as companies kind of try to match with the output that they're projecting or the demand that they're projecting. Is there anything you sense going like that in the services sector, or is it just another element of the years-long continuation? The struggle to find qualified people. And in fact, there was a respondent comment in the report this month to that effect, that it's just hard to find people.
Yeah, it's all across the board, but not negative. So you'll see we're continuing to do some downsizing, not filling open roles, all the way to expanding, ready for Q4, looking forward to a big 2025. So there's quite a blend. When you look at where the numbers came from, it wasn't an increase in downsizing. It wasn't people that saying they were reducing labor. It was a reduction in the number of industries that were saying they were increasing. So going from increasing to stay the same. And after 2 months of hiring, where we were seeing expanding or expansionary numbers in the employment index, it seems very reasonable to me that some of those are now backing off to, we were able to hire the people that we need, and now we're going to be stable through the holidays. Yeah.
Well, at the end of our broadcast on Tuesday with Tim, I made the comment that, we talked about so much, with other things, I didn't get to ask all the questions that I had on my list here. So, this one is kind of our loss on Tuesday is our gain today, because this was one of them. And it's especially relevant because there were a couple of comments in the report from respondents on this topic. Interest rates, we've talked about them for months as a speculation that the Fed was going to take some action and lower them. And it was the possibility. And I guess now it's time to start talking about them a little bit more, since they're now a reality. The context is kind of seemed to be mixed results from reaction in the respondents. Real estate rental and leasing, if you look through the data, they had a really active month, among the leaders in overall growth among the 18 industries. And I think among business activities, new orders, inventories, prices, really active. They were number one in all of those. So, that kind of suggests maybe they're trying to get a jump on the lower. And I know mortgage rates were kind of going in that direction. And then there was that construction comment from someone in the construction industry that, the rate cut impact will likely be delayed, and we may need another one before we really see anything substantial. So just talk about, kind of those mixed results and your general feeling of, now that lower interest rates are a reality and what that might mean for the sector.
So the commentary that we got, specifically the last comment that you cited, sounds very similar to what I'm hearing from different news agencies. Is that good news, but it's not really going to impact anything until the beginning of the year when rates come down a little bit more. I believe the respondent specifically said 150 basis points before they expect to see increased consumer demand for construction. The construction, and I think I mentioned this also already, construction and real estate, we saw going into expansion territory. Utilities consistently, I believe, is still in expansion territory, has been, which no surprise around Bitcoin and AI, that more power is required, and all the investments in green energy that are coming out of the administration. The I guess in summary, I would say that people were anticipating it. The Fed has been pretty direct in saying they're expecting to stay the course with rate reductions unless something unusual happens. All the data is lining up around very stable inflation as well as business activity. So I would expect that trend to continue, and I expect to continue to see those two industry areas improve. We don't have the reliance in all of the industries within the services sector on capital equipment, but we certainly have some. And in those the two that we were talking about, and then when you get into transportation, there's a lot of dependence on being able to finance things, and that should be a real boost for us. It just depends how much is that going to be offset by the port activity and lasting impacts from the hurricane.
Yeah. Prices was another index. I mean, it wasn't significant movement, but it did pick up the pace a little bit. Anything stand out? Any commodities or any respondent comments that stand out? Regarding the prices index and inflation activity.
Yeah, there's still continuing commentary, Dan, that that prices are an issue just in terms of increasing pricing. But if you look throughout our survey history, there are very few times where we saw anything other than a 1-month blip in pricing activity. I was looking at this one pretty closely because of the interest rate discussion. What's happening with inflation versus are there going to be more interest rate cuts coming? When you look at the pricing index for the last 12 months, and then you go back to the prior 12 months, it goes back to an average of 58 versus an average of over 62. So our average over the last 12 months, even with this last 59.4, still has us 4 points below where we were the previous 12 months. And then 12 months before that, it was 80. So when looking back, in history, what's the old investing comment? History doesn't necessarily predict future. But when you look at history, anytime we went into the 70s, it was preceded by a sustained level at the 60s. In fact, the last time it was 6 of the previous 8 months were at 60 or above before it got into the 70 range. So I really don't see, from an inflationary standpoint, anything that's saying we should be concerned. We're kind of around the lowest that we've been in a trailing perspective than we've been in several years. So it seems pretty solid at the moment. Yeah.
Another index that caught my eye this month, you alluded to it when you were discussing the positive movement in business activities and new orders, was new export orders. That's been a frustrating index on the manufacturing side. Tim Fiore has talked about that a lot. Factories and manufacturing companies are not getting a lot of order help from overseas economies because they've been slowing, not providing much support. That hasn't seemed to have been a problem for services as of late. The index has been consistently above 50%. Just are things like, consulting, IT services, some of the other, services exports, they just seem to be in more demand right now?
Yeah, I think you hit two of the key ones, the information and professional services. We're seeing the commentary around, now they're pretty big regions, but the regions that have been cited are South America and Europe, not Asia. And then the other one that was called out was Israel. So maybe it's the military activity that's driving that additional work effort on the services side to support whether it's military operations or other activities that they might have there. We don't have insight into that based on the survey, but it is encouraging to see the exports as well, because it's good news when you're not only supporting your own economy but you're servicing growth elsewhere, and we certainly saw that in the numbers.
Yeah. Well, let's dive in a little bit. We touched on it at the beginning, but maybe dive into it a little bit more, the potential impact of not only the hurricane, but also, the port strike on the eastern Gulf coasts. The kind of interesting timing because the supplier delivery index indicated slower deliveries in September. Would we expect that index to stay in slower territory as a result? And just what are some of the other, potential impacts of the services sector that we should be looking out for?
Yeah, we saw several months of commentary around how supply chain is stabilizing,
Yeah.
and things were improving, and I was frankly attributing the faster deliveries with it being in an expansion territory, but still having faster deliveries to the supply chains getting more robust, and this will put definitely a stitch in that. We're talking to trucking transportation providers ahead of the port impact. They were already moving capacity to the West Coast to be able to service ships that were then being sent to the West Coast. And you can't wait until your ship is docked on the East Coast and can't come in. You've got to reroute ahead of time. And so they're seeing increased ship activity on the West Coast, and because of that, increased trucking activity over there. Well, that's going to impact movement of goods on the East Coast when you lose that capacity. So I'm expecting to see that be a fairly significant impact. Now, whether it's an increase or a decrease in business activity, I guess that remains to be seen. If with the higher inventory, I was listening to a lot of commentary around, well, so what's the impact? Well, a week-long stoppage will probably have a month-long impact in terms of getting back to normal. And if it's a 2-week impact, it'll be a couple of months. Well, I mean, that takes us up to Christmas. That's a huge, huge impact in terms of what'll happen for movement of goods for retail. Everything that's going to be sold, or almost everything that's going to be sold, is already here.
Yeah.
So that's good news. But produce, other retail activities in a industry that's already been hit pretty hard is not good.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned that in an earlier interview that I listened to earlier today, and the inventories index also stood out. That was a substantial increase, 5.2 points compared to August, up from 52.9 to now 58.1. There was some speculation that companies may have been stocking up a little bit, thinking that there might be a port strike. But can you confirm that, or do you think that might have been more what you just said? Companies are prepping for the holiday rush.
Well, so this one has, this is Steve's speculation.
Yeah.
Based on looking at different numbers. We saw exports up, which is increased business activity. We saw business activity up. We saw new orders up. On the other side, we saw imports up, and we saw inventory up. I think it's reasonable to conclude from that that people were bringing stuff in early in anticipation that maybe something was going to happen, and inventory being up, getting ready for holidays, or seeing that new order volume coming in, and having inventory available to fulfill those orders, like in construction and utilities. The other part of that, which I think, Dan, adds a little bit more support to maybe bringing in things early, is along with that shift, inventory sentiment was closer to we have the right amount from we have too much. So when you see we have the right amount coming down to, or we have too much coming down to we have the right amount, at the same time as we're seeing inventories go up, very intentional is what it looks like. And I would expect that the port, if it were me, I definitely would have been doing that.
Yeah. Just for context on what Steve was saying, inventory sentiment index was 54 even this month compared to 54.9 in August. So yeah, that does kind of validate that sentiment if that's the speculation.
And Dan, when we look back on history on inventory sentiment, why don't we do that here for a second? Inventory sentiment, the last time it was 54 or below, looks like June of 23. And in June of 23, inventory was up around 56. So lower than we are today, but people feeling pretty good about it. So that seems to make sense, and hopefully it predicts some healthy behavior, during the buying season.
Right. Well, yeah, we've discussed all the moving parts that businesses and executives need to be aware of, and shoot, man, anything going on in a month that might have a significant impact on businesses and business planning for 2025. I mean, that's been a lot of talk. Not only in the manufacturing sector, Tim mentioned it on Tuesday, but businesses in general, they're going through their planning, and a lot of executives. There were a couple of comments in the services report. Hey, we're not going full bore until on our 2025 planning until we know what the balance of power in Washington is going to be. Just to discuss that dynamic and some other things, that businesses and executives need to be aware of as they're planning their 2025 year, and how does the Services PMI data and some of the insights that can be gleaned from there factor in?
I saw those comments also on concern or questions around how the election goes. But both candidates are talking about spending more money, but they're talking about spending more money in different areas. And let's say you're a utility company and you're going, okay, interest rates are coming down. This is great. We can invest more. Are we going to organize around a pipeline, or are we going to organize around more wind farms? And because it's going to be very different depending on which administration comes in. So you now check the box. Looks like interest rates are coming down to where this is a feasible project, or more projects are feasible. But we can't actually pull the trigger until we know who's going to be in office. And the likelihood of then their ideas getting passed through Congress is another question altogether, which you really don't know until a week after the election, how that's really going to pan out. So certainly reasonable to be cautious. So that, in context to a 54.9, that's really good news, I think. So I think we're probably not seeing the full impact or opinions around the business impact of inventory reductions yet, because pulling the trigger on those long-term investments, you're going to amortize or depreciate capital equipment over 10 or 20 years. So without knowing really what's going to happen over the next 4, it's kind of tough to do that. The other thing on the overall number, it's not a glorious Q3. So there's a big number, or big-ish number in September, but when you look at the average for Q3, it's the lowest Q3 since 2009. So although we're headed in the right direction, we'd want to see another set of 54s, 53s, 55s coming at us to really have confidence that the services economy is growing, consistently again.
Sure.
I think if any message that I'd have kind of to business leaders out there is things are looking positive when you're looking at your scenarios, looking at growth as coming a higher percentage likelihood, but certainly not in the bag.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'd like to add is that, we were talking about the election, and that reminds me that the November-December issue of Inside Supply Management does have a nice feature article as we, examine some of the supply chain issues that are related to the presidential election, and, where both of the candidates stand on some of the issues that supply chain professionals and organizations are talking about. And Steve Miller was one of the people quoted in that article. He's got lots of good insights and some others, so be sure to check that out if you can. Steve, those are all the questions that I had for this month, and another interesting month of the data. Anything that we haven't talked about so far that I haven't asked that you think might be important?
No, I think the two takeaways, the pricing and kind of how that relates historically, and then just the Q3, how that relates historically, would be the two that I'd keep an eye on as we go forward. Get ready for sustained growth, but be a little bit cautious on pulling the trigger on things that are long-term commitments until a couple of things settle out between now and the end of November.
Yeah. All right. Well, great. Steve, thanks for the time today. And yeah, we'll get our viewers out here maybe a couple minutes early, give you a couple minutes back of your workday. But thanks for joining us today. And for more information, feel free to go to ismworld.org, where in a little bit you can read our roundup article that details a lot of what Steve and I have discussed here, and as well as how markets are responding to the data. And if you'd like to be a part of the ISM Manufacturing Services or Hospital Business Survey panels that help compile data for the report on business, you can visit ismworld.org/join the panel for more information. So we'll see you back here in a month's time when we'll break down the October ISM Services PMI data. And for Steve Miller and some people who helped us behind the scenes today, their names are Christina Cahill and Jennifer Stevens. My name is Dan Zeiger. We'll see you next time.